Today it's my great pleasure to speak with you about one of the towering figures of American history, Thomas Jefferson, and about an aspect of his political thought that we almost, as a group, almost certainly know very little about it because very little has been written about it. And this is Thomas Jefferson's attitudes towards voluntary associations, towards, frankly, the private sector, as he thought about the relationship between the private sector and government. Voluntary associations, just for purposes of definition, are all those private groups formally organized, intending to accomplish some defined purpose. Sometimes it's just fraternity, sometimes it's actual social reform. And these were a relatively new thing in the Western world. When the United States became an independent nation, as in so many things, Ben Franklin was a pioneer. And if you remember his autobiography, you remember just how new these things were, all these clubs and associations that were privately organized and intending to do something good in the community. And Thomas Jefferson, this is what might surprise you, had decidedly mixed feelings about whether these were good or bad things for the citizenry of the United States. And this debate that he had with himself and with his friend James Madison actually helped to give us some insights into his attitudes about government. This is, of course, coming from the president of the American Philosophical Society, which Jefferson was, a man who sat down at Poplar Forest and drew up a mock constitution for an agricultural society, from a man who was part of a college fraternity in his days at William and Mary. But he also had really strong feelings about the potential abuses of private power. He was worried about the creation of entities that sought to do things that he believed were best left to democratically elected governments. He was skeptical of allowing privately organized bodies to claim much authority at all over their own members, or of allowing them to act in ways that might usurp the authority of the greatest power that Jefferson knew, the voice of the people. In many ways, this aspect of Jefferson's thinking can help us to reveal a man who has certain characteristics of a modern-day libertarian. For example, the preservation of rights was the core purpose of any government, from Jefferson's perspective, but who was, to his dying day, on July 4th, 1826, far more comfortable with institutions of government than he was with institutions of what we now call the private sector. Only the former, only government, was endowed with their authority by the sovereign voice of the people. To be sure, both government and the private sector in Jefferson's day were very different animals from what they had become in the 21st century. But the most enjoyable aspect of exploring the mind of Thomas Jefferson is that his opinions often do speak to us directly across a chasm of a couple of hundred years, because his beliefs rested on a foundation of values that remain our own, even as the particular applications of them have evolved to include things that Thomas Jefferson did not, to be applied in ways that Jefferson would not have accepted as legitimate. But still, his views, grounded as they were on principles of equality and natural rights, that ought to resonate with us as strongly today as they did in his or in Lincoln's day, remain the foundation of our 236-year-old nation, one that came into existence with words penned by Thomas Jefferson. So it's worth examining this. In a small way, since the 1940s, but in a much grander scale since the fall of the Iron Curtain, American historians, political scientists, sociologists have paid close attention to the nature of American civil society, all those associations, institutions that exist between the family and the state, and how these help a democracy to function. But Jefferson was especially ambivalent. And many Americans in the post-revolutionary generation were especially ambivalent about the existence of groups that were unknown to the Constitution, of their respective states or the federal government. He wasn't always 100% consistent on this point. For instance, when George Washington criticized the Democratic Republican societies, which were political groups that formed to resist many of the policies of his administration, Jefferson defended these groups. He believed that their motives were good, that they were a necessary corrective to the bad tendencies of Alexander Hamilton. But over time, and particularly after he came to believe that the principles of the Revolution of '76 had been more or less secured by the Revolution of 1800, he came to believe that the accumulation of power in institutions and associations outside of democratically elected government could well be a tremendously destructive thing. And so, late in his life, Jedediah Morse, a geographer, a clergyman in New England, wrote to Thomas Jefferson asking him for Jefferson's support for his newly created association, which he called the American Society for Promoting the Civilization and General Improvement of the Indian Tribes within the United States. He formed this group in March 1822, And Jefferson responded to Morse's letter in which he had asked Jefferson to become a member to support the cause. Jefferson responded to Morse's letter with some remarkable denunciations of a group like this intending to accomplish something that he believed the government ought to accomplish. I shall not undertake to draw the line of demarcation between private associations of laudable views and unimposing numbers, and those whose magnitude may rivalize and jeopardize the march of regular government. Yet such a line does exist, he wrote to Morse, and he went on to scold him at length in this letter for this idea of creating an association to minister and to civilize the Indians. I have seen the days, Jefferson wrote, and he's speaking of the Revolution, when even this last and perilous engine became necessary, that is, creating an association instead of having the government accomplish some collective purpose. That was the case where the regular authorities of government had combined against the rights of the people, and no means of correction remained to them but to organize a collateral power, which with their support might rescue and secure their violated rights. But such is not the case with our government. Here, he described associations as a means to subvert a despotic government and to restore the liberties of the people. That he wholeheartedly endorsed. In a democratic republic in which we lived in 1822, Jefferson wasn't sure that the application was at all useful to create a private association instead of simply calling on the government to accomplish a purpose that the people could agree on. This is something that he also described during his presidency. In a letter to William Duane, in which William Duane had, on behalf of a committee of men, responded to a certain policy in Philadelphia and wanted to notify the president of their attitudes toward it. And Jefferson responded to William Duane saying that this self-created committee of men that were sending a letter to the president, he wasn't sure that he had any business responding to an association, to a committee that was writing to him with their opinions. He called this self-created committee a body whose organization is unknown to the Constitution. And he said, and this is in 1803 to William Duane, and this is of course fascinating in light of the Supreme Court's recent decision in Citizens United that corporations have a right to free speech, that the opinions offered by individuals and of right are on a different ground. They are sanctioned by the Constitution, which is also prescribed when they choose to act in bodies, the organization, objects, and rights of those bodies. And so he was happy to respond to William Duane and to other members individually of this Ward Committee, but their collective speech he had no interest in hearing. Jefferson said this explicitly while president. I'll let you fill in the necessary blanks if you want to speculate how Jefferson would have received news of the Citizens United decision, in which the Supreme Court ruled that corporations have First Amendment rights to free speech that allow them to spend largely unlimited amounts of money to articulate a political position. But Jefferson did not believe that these organizations, unknown to the Constitution, as he said, had a collective speech in which he was interested in listening as president. Back to 1822, when Jedediah Morse had asked Jefferson to join ranks in this organization. Jefferson decided to scold Morse for this plan to create a non-governmental organization. That's actually a term that frankly does apply to this, an NGO, to educate and to civilize Native Americans. Jefferson called Morses Society Morses Society, which was an attempt to accomplish this goal of ministering to and civilizing the Indians, a formidable array. But it was particularly worrisome for Jefferson because of how it was organized. It was going to include men. He was asking, Morse was asking not just Jefferson and Madison, former presidents, but he was asking the sitting president to become a member of this organization. And he wanted government officials to join as voting members to lend their support to this clearly admirable cause from Jefferson and Morse's position. But Jefferson did not like the fact that that meant that sitting president, sitting government officials would be joining ranks with well, frankly, clergy. Jefferson was very unhappy that many members of this organization were going to be clergymen, and he wrote explicitly to Morse that because the clergy will constitute 19/20ths of this association, and by the law of the majority may command the 20th part, that is, people like Jefferson and Madison, if they happen to join, which composed of all the high authorities of the United States, civil and military, may be outvoted and wielded by the 19 parts with uncontrollable power, both as to purpose and process. Jefferson was concerned that allowing sitting government officials to become a part of an organization in which they could be outvoted by non-government officials potentially had democratic repercussions. It is a fearful array. It will be said that these are imaginary fears, he acknowledged to Morse, But the fears are indeed imaginary, but the example is real. Under its authority as a precedent, future associations will arise with objects at which we would shudder at this time. One of Jefferson's real concerns here is that this was a goal best left to government. And he comes back to say it explicitly. Granted, he knew far less of governmental inefficiencies than we know today, but he was certainly no anti-government zealot. Listen to what he tells Morse. The government is, at this moment, going on with the process of civilizing the Indians. Is it that a plan originated by a meeting of private individuals is better than that prepared by the concentrated wisdom of the nation, of men not self-chosen but clothed with the full confidence of the people? Is it that there is no danger that a new authority marching independently alongside government in the same line and to the same object may not produce collision, may not thwart and obstruct the operations of the government, or wrest the object entirely from their hands? And how many societies, auxiliary to government, may we expect to see spring up in imitation of this, offering to associate themselves in this and that of its functions? Remember, Morse had just sent a polite letter asking him to join this club, and Jefferson goes on a very long tirade about the functions of government, the proper functions of government, and the potential dangers of private organizations attempting to supplant them. In sum, he wrote to Morse at the end of this long letter in response, thinking as I do that this association is unnecessary, that the government is proceeding to the same object under control of the law, that they are competent to it in its wisdom, in means and inclination, that this association, this wheel within a wheel, is more likely to produce collision than aid, that it is, in its magnitude of dangerous example, I am bound to say that as a dutiful citizen, I cannot in conscience become a member of this society. Before writing to Morse, the 78-year-old Jefferson did seek the advice of a man that he constantly conferred with and discussed his concerns, and a man who actually helped Jefferson formulate his own thoughts, and more often than not to rein them in a bit with a healthy dose of reality. And that man is, of course, James Madison. He wrote to Madison, sure that he had also received the same letter from Jedediah Morse. And he pointed out to him that at this moment, he rehearsed some of the lines that he had used with Jedediah Morse as he was writing to both men basically simultaneously. And he pointed out to Madison that at this moment, no abuses call for revolution, voluntary association so extensive as to grapple with and control the government. Should such be or become their purpose, these associations are dangerous machines and should be frowned down in every regulated government. This object of ministering to the Indians, Jefferson wrote, is one which the government is pursuing with superior means, superior wisdom, and under limits of legal prescription. Now, Madison largely poo-pooed Jefferson's concerns here. He called the society rather ostentatious than dangerous. If nothing else, he noted, echoing his famous argument from Federalist 10, the members embraced by it are too numerous, too heterogeneous, too much dispersed to concentrate their views in any covert or illicit object. Madison believed, he ultimately did join, Jefferson did not. Madison believed that the organization was not a threat. But he did share with Jefferson the basic idea that, in fact, the government's seeking to accomplish this purpose might be better equipped and more circumscribed by law in its operations. And because of that, perhaps this association was seeking to do something that the government might better do. Now, if one draws parallels to the modern corporation to step back and take a look at Jefferson's views here. With its inordinate amount of power in modern society, I think we can all agree that they're remarkably powerful compared to the corporations of Thomas Jefferson's day. Its distance and legal insulation from the corrective devices of majoritarian democracy. Some of Jefferson's worries appear as relevant today as the day he formulated them. In fact, perhaps even more relevant. But if one draws parallels to the other institutions of civil society, all those groups that in fact are bringing people from all walks of life together to pursue a shared cause, to provide support for one another, well, then it appears that maybe we have more to fear from apathy and indifference than from voluntary associations as some kind of formidable array. Still, I believe the Jefferson skepticism about the excessive accumulation of private power in a Republican government should tell us something important about the attitudes of the founders towards the government they fought so hard to create. They did not create these governments because they hated them. Indeed, when one explores Jefferson's thoughts about privately created, voluntarily joined associations, it appears that Jefferson was somewhat more wary of private excesses of power than we often remember today. And the reasons were quintessentially Jeffersonian. That is, his unceasing efforts to protect individual rights, of government as a means to achieve that end. And in that light, we can remember that Jefferson had sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. That is not just against the tyranny of King George III or of illegitimate governments, but of any creation that would infringe upon the equal and natural rights to the protection of which Jefferson had committed his life. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.